like to start with the big picture first to help you understand like where we're going. So I think that what we do as school psychologists is so critically important to so many children. And especially when we do a comprehensive assessment. I mean, think of all the children's lives you have changed as a result of the work that you do, trying to understand how they learn best, trying to understand what might be interfering with their ability to learn. So I take this really, really seriously because we do have tremendous impact on the people that we work with. And I would also suggest that what we're doing in terms of comprehensive assessment, especially cognitive assessment, in a lot of ways is outdated. And today I'm going to show you in a short amount of time some of the strengths and limitations of traditional IQ and the tools that we have to understand them and interpret them. But here's the really good news. The good news is that we do have research that clearly shows that measuring basic psychological processes instead of traditional IQ is more socially just. It's more effective for identification of children who have a specific learning disability. And it provides instructional guidance in really very important ways. It also is not encumbered by knowledge, which I'll talk some more about. So this is the big picture for today. This article that I have on the screen is one that just came out a few weeks ago. You can also get that on my website. Yeah, that's kind of the written version of what we're going to do today. So this is the basic outline. We're going to talk about traditional IQ tests, strengths and weaknesses. We're going to talk about measuring basic psychological processes and the advantages of measuring cognitive processes. And we'll do that in the 53 minutes that we have left. So let's think about why we have what we have. I mean, oftentimes when we say, oh, I'm using a new test, the 5th edition of something, I chuckle because we know the history. The history is really very important. And I'm going to help you understand this through my own history. So my interest in intelligence and instruction really started out in my first profession as a professional musician. This is the first band I ever played in. And when I was only 17, I was teaching guitar. And I learned that some of my students really were able to learn well and do really well, and others didn't. And I really wanted to know why. When I went off to college, I really resonated towards psychology because really that helped me understand how not only people, but through animal learning and other models, brain-based learning, helped me understand how people learn. That's what I'm all about. How do we understand how people learn, and how do we know how to measure that? When I started working as a school psychologist, I worked in this school that's shown here, Champaign Elementary School, in the mid-70s. And I noticed something really curious, but I never really grasped the importance of it until later. And that was when I gave my intelligence test, a whisk at that time, and even still today, I noticed that a lot of the questions on the whisk were just like the tests on the achievement test, the test items on the achievement test I was giving. And I thought it was weird, like you'd have vocabulary on your IQ test and vocabulary on an achievement test. Or you'd have math, arithmetic, word problems on both, and so on. This doesn't really make sense. And I think that the similarity of intelligence and achievement tests today is really the biggest problem that we have in our field. We should not give intelligence tests that demand knowledge, especially to students who aren't doing well in school because they've had some kind of learning disability, because then their IQ scores look lower than they really are. So any kind of an achievement-based measure of intelligence is going to be inappropriate for someone who hasn't had the opportunity to learn. This is really the fundamental social justice issue that my colleague and friend Tulio Otero and I have been writing about and speaking at NASP. That this is really a social justice problem. And as I mentioned, it's especially problematic for students who have a learning disability. Think about it. You don't read much, you don't get a good vocabulary. And when you sit down and you get tested by the school psychologist, we give a vocabulary test and we say it's one of the best measures of G on this instrument. Well, it may be, but it's confounded by knowledge. Because an ability test should measure thinking, not knowing. An ability test should help you understand how a person thinks, how well they can think, not be confounded by how much they know. So why do we have this problem? Just a little bit of history about this. You know, the traditional IQ test that we use today, the Weissler, the Binet, even the Woodcock cognitive, differential ability scales, they all really are closely related to the work of the US military in the early 1900s. People like Thorndike and Otis of Otis Lennon and others, when they developed the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. In 1917, after developing and then testing these instruments, they determined that the tests were effective for aiding and segregating, eliminating mentally incompetent and classifying men according to their mental ability. And so I really think of this 1917 as the birth date of the traditional IQ with verbal and quantitative and nonverbal subtests. And now, of course, they're morphing into different kinds of scales, but basically it's the same thing. So, you know, what we had was an Army Alpha. So this was all the vocabulary kind of stuff. And sorry, I just want to try to move this out of the way. And what we had was the Army Beta, which is, you could call it nonverbal, like a mazes or coding or object assembly. Now, take a look at whose book I made a copy of. Weissler was a military examiner. He gave the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And really, Weissler had verbal and nonverbal portions of his test, right? But why did he have nonverbal tests? Just like the military, why did they have that? Because when people like this, Antonino Mirenda, left southern Italy on this boat of the Canard Line, he would have landed at Ellis Island, which in fact he did. And when he was there, they would have asked him questions. And I'm sure he would have said, no capito, he doesn't understand. They would have put a little chalk mark X on his lapel because of screening out for very low functioning individuals at that time. And I know they would have given him a test like this, which is object assembly, and how he would have solved it very readily. And they would have said to him, go to Little Italy where you belong, which is what he did. He lived in this building on 111 Mulberry Street. He was my grandfather. And my grandfather never went beyond 8th grade in Italy. And he didn't know a lot, but he was smart enough to have his own grocery store, to be a successful businessman. That's why we had this Alpha and Beta, because as Yoakum and Yerkes said in their book, men who fail in Alpha, the verbal, are sent to Beta in order that injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English may be avoided. They saw this social justice issue 100 years ago. I was never taught this in the many years that I was taught cognitive assessment. We should have been. Now I'm going to give you, I mean, it's not a Saturday Night Live weekend update, but I'm going to give you a little research update here to just give us a bit of perspective on things. Now, Research on G. Of course, G is an important concept in our field. It's talked about quite a lot, G or general ability. If you go back and you look at Weissler's definition, the aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally and deal effectively with this environment, aside from being, not very politically correct, his, her would have been better. It's really getting at overall ability, not verbal and nonverbal abilities, plural, which we so often talk about. And interestingly, in the foreword of the Weissler Nonverbal, of which I'm the author with David Weissler, who was actually the best co-author I ever had, because he never objected to anything I said, because he was dead since the 80s, and we published a lot of it long after that. But anyway, look at what Alan Kelpman wrote about Weissler's view. The emphasis in the Weissler Nonverbal Manual on the full scale that measures general ability non-verbally and not nonverbal ability is a way in which what I proposed and what I did with the Weissler Nonverbal was so consistent with Weissler. Because Weissler remained a firm believer in Spearman's G theory. He believed that verbal and performance, or nonverbal, scales represented different ways to access G, but he never believed in nonverbal or verbal intelligence as being separate from G. This is really very important because, of course, we are encouraged to go well beyond G. Now, there's been a series of research articles that if you don't know about, you should learn about. And they've been done by a number of people, some of which I've known, like Marley Watkins, who's one of the authors on this this article. I've known Marley since early 1980s, and Gary Canavay, who I've known for a very long time. These are people that I know and I value their opinion. They've done a line of research on all the traditional tests using a variety of different psychoanalytic methods. And what they've found consistently is this small proportions of variance uniquely captured by the part scores, but support for the use of the scale, the total score. In other words, they're saying the total score has value, but we can't find enough variance accounted for by the parts to say that they should be interpreted. This recent paper also looked at this issue, especially as it relates to CHC, and they went back and reanalyzed John Carroll's work, and their results were the same. The results of the study indicate that most of the cognitive abilities specified in the three-stratum theory have little to no interpretive relevance beyond that of G, or general intelligence. That's a really strong statement. So it's what they're suggesting is focus the score interpretations on measures of general intelligence. And it's not just these two articles, it's a whole bunch of articles. So the implications are that the scales on traditional IQ tests are irrelevant. That puts us in a really tough spot because we really want to be able to measure more than just G, because we really want to understand why a student is failing. We need to know more than G. I mean, G, if you think about it, the whole ability achievement discrepancy thing for SLD, I mean, that failed because you're just comparing one big total score to academics. You never really found out what's wrong, but you can't get anything wrong because you require the overall score to be in the average range. So we've been hurting ourselves and they're hurting the kids. So we have to keep in mind that why we have this problem with traditional IQ tests is because they're based on 100-year-old concepts of what the content of tests should be. There is no theoretical conceptualization behind those tests. They weren't built on brain function. And most importantly, they require too much knowledge. The knowledge piece is really very problematic. Now, the only exception to this line of research, the only exception that has been reported in terms of all the different tests. So if, for example, these authors have looked at the WISC-4, the WISC-5, the WAIS-4, the Stanford-Binet, the RIAS, the WASI, and on and on and on and on. But the only test that they found that had enough variance accounted for after G was cognitive assessment system, the test that I published. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So this is the literature. You can go read all these articles and get all this literature that's out there. I'm just presenting it to you so you know what's what. Now, let's think about this. Let's just let's just take one more little step here. Some people have said to me that yes, tests like the Stanford-Binet, WISC-5, the WJ, even the parts of the KBC, they have tests that require knowledge, especially verbal tests. And they say that these tests have validity as measures of intelligence because they're so highly correlated with G. I don't accept that logic. And I especially don't accept the logic that we should have tests of intelligence that have knowledge in them. I think about the tests that we have on a continuum, like the Stanford Achievement Test, the KT, the Woodcock Achievement Test. These are tests that are designed to measure knowledge. Tests like Steve Pfeiffer's measures, good measures of knowledge. Steve goes a little further than that, though. If you read my work with Steve, you'll see how. When you get to the Woodcock Cognitive and the WISC and the KBC, if you're not using the Luria model, then these are confounded by knowledge. It's not until you get to the nonverbal tests or like the CAS or like the UNIT, for example, Bruce Bracken's and Steve McCallum's, that you get tests that are going to measure thinking more than knowing. And just as a point of reference here, if you read Joe Matarazzo, I don't know, I don't think Joe Matarazzo is as widely known as he was when I was first learning cognitive assessment, but he and Weissler wrote a lot together, and he has a very famous book, Weissler's Adult Appraisal. And I know Joe, I've known him for a long time. I have tremendous respect for him, and I've spoken to him about this. But if you read their book, Joe clearly says that a man's vocabulary is necessarily influenced by his educational and cultural opportunities. And when referring to the arithmetic subtest, its merits are diminished by the fact that it's influenced by education. So the impact of education on intelligence tests has been clearly known for a long time, but we ignore it. We ignore it all the time. I saw it as a new school psychologist, but I just did what we all do. I talked about verbal intelligence and nonverbal intelligence because that's what I was taught back then, but I don't do that anymore. Now, as I was saying, some people say that the subtests with verbal content are needed also because they correlate so well with achievement. And of course, this is a circular argument. If you have achievement in your intelligence test, you shouldn't be surprised that it correlates with your achievement test. Now, in my book that I published with Tullio Otero, we present evidence that, in fact, if you compare the correlations between all the different traditional tests with achievement and a non-traditional test, the CAS, with achievement, the that using basic psychological processes actually correlates higher with achievement than these other instruments do. But recently, an important paper was published, and that's this paper by George Georgiou. This is a meta-analysis. They looked at all the research on the relationship between task theory and academic achievement, and what they concluded was that past theory correlated with achievement higher than any of the other achievement tests that have been published. So again, that's a good study to look at.